lovelies, and welcome back. I'm Lex Carline, and this is Seriously Now, where we talk about all the things. Now, it's been a little while, so I'm really excited to be able to welcome you back. I'm really sorry that we kind of disappeared and fell off the face of the earth for a little while. I slightly lost my mind, all the stress of uni, the wonky body. It was a bit of a ride, but we're back, and we're ready to get to it. So originally when I started this podcast, we were going to talk about, as we say, all the things. Kind of seems like we got a bit sidetracked and focused on the true crime rather than anything else, but there's nothing wrong with that. But if we're going to talk about all the things, we need to talk about all the things. So the paranormal, horrible histories, alternate dimensions, anything you can think of, we're going to try and talk about it here. So here's to more variety, because, supposed to be the spice of life after all. So today, we are going to go back to the 1500s in a little place called St. Osyth in Essex, England. And as you may have guessed by the name of the episode, it's to do with witches. More specifically, a woman named Ursula Kempe. Now in 1563, witchcraft was made a capital offence in Britain, and between then and around 1750, there were roughly 200,000 suspected witches tortured, burned or hung in Western Europe. The first witchcraft executions in England took place in Chelmsford in Essex in 1566, just 3 years after the law had been passed. Now stereotypically, those who were accused of witchcraft were usually older, impoverished women with a cat. So, watch out for crazy cat ladies, which will be me one day. The cats were assumed to be familiars, which is a demon usually in animal form given by the devil or inherited from another witch. So these familiars are said to be proof of witchcraft. Okay, lady has a cat, must be a witch. Gotta love it. In fact, such was the hysteria around witches that in 1579, Queen Elizabeth I actually paid a visit to St. Osyth Priory. She there assembled the local justices of the peace and actually chastised them for their failure to prosecute witches. So, naturally, obviously, they'd been given a kick up the arse, and just 3 years later in 1582, 14 women from the area were put on trial in Chelmsford for witchcraft, including Ursula Kempe. And it all started over a simple feud. Now, the feud we are talking about obviously involves Ursula Kempe and also a lady named Grace Thurlow. They were both long-standing residents of St. Osyth, and the previous year, Grace's son Davy had been very, very sick. Ursula, she struggled to make a living as a local nursemaid and midwife. She visited the Thurlow household to check on the boy and performed a well-known folk ritual as an attempt to help little Davy. She took his hand and spoke the words, "A good child, how thou art loaden." She then got to her feet and left the house, before returning moments later and repeating the words to the child. This ritual she performed 3 times, one straight after the other, whilst Grace watched on. She was clearly comforted by Ursula's actions and the meaning behind them, and actually asked the woman to return to them that night. So far they're playing nice. After the ritual, Ursula assured Grace that Davy was now on the mend, and in fact he was, as the night passed with him in the most comfort he'd felt since falling ill. So yay for Davy, yay. Grace was also actually pregnant at the time, and Ursula had assumed, which where assumptions lead, that given their apparent blossoming friendship and her experience already in midwifery, that she would be asked to be Grace's midwife when the time came. So 3 months later, it came to light that Grace had actually intended to ask another woman to be her midwife. Ursula was just a little bit upset about this, and she made it very clear that she was not going to tolerate such a snub. I mean, I know times were hard and stuff, and nobody likes their nose put out of joint, but really? Okay. So this was the first sign that the 2 women were not as close as Ursula had presumed. Now, in a thinly veiled threat from Grace, she reminded Ursula of a bout of lameness that she was troubled with, and basically said that if it carried on, she would go to the magistrates and point the blame at Ursula. She's making me lame. She's making me lame. Grace went on to say that Ursula had a naughty name, and so it would be easy to suggest that the lameness actually came from a not-so-natural cause. So obviously this was not an idle threat, but even Ursula wasn't particularly bothered by the threats or her name being connected with witchcraft. And Ursula herself had even admitted that whilst she was able to unwitch those who had been bewitched, she actually didn't possess the power herself to bewitch anyone. She even offered to show Grace how to unwitch herself and cure her own lameness. Conveniently, all she had to do was send away the other unwanted midwife and let Ursula help. I mean, it's pretty devious if you ask me, but the woman bought it, so gotta give her some points there. Grace would go on to deliver a healthy baby girl without any complications. But it wouldn't be long before the two women would clash again. This time, it was over who would nurse or breastfeed the baby, because obviously in times gone by they had such things as wet nurses. Ultimately, Grace decided to nurse her own child, even whilst continuing her work as a maid. Fair play to her. You know, it's her baby after all. And it's not like she was saying no to Ursula and then having somebody else nurse the child. She was just doing it herself. All was fine until the baby girl was about 3 months old, when devastatingly she fell from her cot, broke her neck, and passed away. Now, Ursula did extend her condolences. Oh, no, wait! No, she didn't. In fact, she went the other way, and she even went as far as to tell the bereft mother that the tragedy could have been avoided if only Ursula had been allowed to nurse the child instead of Grace. This, just to be fair, makes Ursula sound like a petty, vindictive bitch. But if she wasn't, we probably wouldn't have this story, so hey. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that after this, the two women remained on bad terms. And whilst Grace was dealing with the grief and the loss of her child, she suffered another bout of the lameness that had previously bothered her. Then Ursula arrives unannounced at the Thurlow household and told Grace she would cure her for 12 pence, which is roughly just over a tenner today. Grace, at this point, was suffering tremendously, so naturally she agreed. And for around about 5 weeks following this visit, Grace's physical pain, at least, seemed to be relieved, so it worked. For a while. But when it came time for Ursula to collect her money, Grace admitted that she couldn't actually pay her because she was an impoverished maid. Can't pull those coins out of your butt. If only we could. Now Ursula, in all fairness, did offer a counter in lieu of the money that she would take, and that she would take cheese as a payment instead. But sadly Grace had no cheese either. An argument ensued, another one, yes, and an enraged Ursula stormed off. And this was the final straw in the women's friendship? We're using that term loosely. Grace's lameness was said to return that very same day, but much worse than it had been before. And whenever Grace would start to feel better, Davy, who now was her only surviving child, would worsen, and if he felt better, she felt worse. So they were stuck in this vicious cycle, and Grace was so lame some days that she couldn't even get out of bed. So it does seem very random, doesn't it? Could other forces have been at play? Well, Grace Thurlow definitely thought so. On the 19th of February 1582, Grace would speak to Justice of the Peace Brian Darcy about her former friend. Now, we have no idea of knowing if Grace had any clue of where this would end, but this would begin a chain of events leading to disastrous consequences for the community of St. Osyth. Grace would tell Darcy all about the suffering that had befallen her family, and naturally she blamed Ursula for all of it. Though we don't know if Grace accepted Ursula's help during the birth of her daughter, but if she did, she certainly didn't reveal it. Unfortunately for Ursula, Grace was not the only one to accuse her of witchcraft, and on the very same day, Agnes Leatherdale did the same. Agnes told Darcy that Ursula had sent her son to ask Agnes for scouring sand for the trade of dyeing a pair of tights. Agnes claimed she knew Ursula was wicked, so sent her none. Agnes admitted that she had no problem giving sand to others, But Ursula happened to see Agnes's daughter making another transaction, and this angered the woman. Allegedly, Ursula muttered something inaudible, but shortly after, one of Agnes's children was struck down with a strange and terrible illness, with a great swelling in the bottom of the belly and other privy parts. Agnes would go on to say to Darcy that about a week before she spoke to him, she had seen a cunning man or woman to get to the bottom of her child's suffering. The answer was absolute. Ursula Kempe had bewitched the child. Now she, like Grace, had said that Ursula was unfazed by this revelation, stating that she had not done a thing, and nor did she believe Agnes had visited anyone. However, Agnes continued to believe Ursula's guilt, and her child was said to have provided further evidence supporting what the cunning person had told her. Whilst on the way to Mother Ratcliffe's home, another woman who was well known for her ability to remove bewitchings, the child pointed straight at Ursula's house and shouted, "Woo, woo!" interpreted as the child making their own accusation. Yeah, take from that what you will. And the child apparently made the exact same accusation, or just gesture, on the journey home. Mother Ratcliffe had said that she thought there was not much to be done for the child, who, whilst Agnes spoke to Darcy, was still in a very bad way. Couldn't possibly have been that the child was just naturally sick? No, I suppose in these times it was witches, witches, witches. So the day after Grace and Agnes had spoken to Brian Darcy, Ursula was taken in for questioning. Now, unfortunately, we are purely left to our own imagination as to how Ursula felt at this time. Was she worried? Not bothered? She wasn't bothered when the two women accused her directly of witchcraft. Was she bothered being hauled in for questioning? Who knows? But one thing that does seem to come across is that Ursula really didn't give a shit what people said about her. So, woo, go Ursula, I suppose. Now, she would go on to tell Darcy that a decade or so before, she herself had suffered a bout of lameness and went to visit the wife of a man named Cock in Wheely, which is a village about 5 miles away. The wife had told Ursula that she had been bewitched, and after Ursula begged the woman not only to help her, but to teach her to cure herself, the wife obliged. Mixing hog's dung, yummy, and charvel together, hold the mixture in your left hand and a knife in your right. Prick the medicine 3 times and then throw it into the fire. Then you must take 3 pricks under a table before sticking the knife there. Then finally, take 3 sage leaves and the same amount of herb john and put them in ale, which was to be drunk first thing in the morning and again last thing at night. If the instructions were followed correctly, this should lift the bewitching. Quite straightforward. And much to Ursula's amazement, her condition improved greatly. So, wanting to share the knowledge and the wealth with everybody, which included the wives of Page and Grey, whom she also declared bewitched, satisfyingly, all of the women were cured. Darcy, however, at this point, was not impressed. Although Ursula was talking freely, she had yet to speak about the reasons she herself had been brought in. So, to get her talking, Darcy made Ursula a promise. Would you trust him? I don't think I would. And he told her that if she made a full truthful confession, she would be treated leniently and would have nothing to worry about. Allegedly then, Ursula burst into tears and fell to her knees before Darcy, confessing of how she had 4 familiars, 2 male and 2 female. The females were said to cause lameness and bodily harm to those of her choosing, and they were also used to harm cattle. The males were said to be more dangerous. They brought death to those Ursula really wanted to punish. And when she was pressed a little further, she revealed that the males were Titty, a grey cat, and Jack, a black cat. The females were a black toad called Piggin and a white lamb called Tiffin. Titty had gone to Grace and Piggin to the Thurlow child, with Tiffin being sent to knock over the Thurlow's baby cradle. Ursula was also said to have confessed to causing the death of her own sister-in-law by sending Jack to torment her. This was in retaliation for calling her a witch and a whore. Seems like she took more offence to being called a whore than a witch. Well, I'll give her that one, okay? I think I'd rather be called a witch too. Now, at the time of Ursula's interview, both Grace Thurlow and Agnes Leatherdale were in the house, and so they were brought upstairs to see their alleged tormentor. Ursula fell to her knees and was said to beg the two women for their forgiveness, and she also went on to incriminate another local woman, Alice Newman. Ursula claimed that at her bidding, Alice sent spirits to make both Agnes's child and Grace Thurlow suffer. Therefore, she was just as involved as Ursula herself. But, just the very next day, Ursula seemed to have a change of heart, telling Darcy that she'd failed to mention something. She told him around 3 months ago Alice had come to her house and the two women had disagreed. Ursula disagree with someone? Really? Surely not. During which time, Alice called her a witch and threatened to report her to Darcy. Yet another threat that Ursula clearly hadn't taken seriously. Especially as afterwards, the two women had become friendly again later that same day, with Alice even taking one of Ursula's spirits in a pot. They had continued as friends, and around Christmas time of that year, Ursula had told Alice about her falling out with Grace. She also admitted asking Alice to send Titty to Grace to cause her suffering. Once the spirit returned to say the task had been completed, Ursula allowed it to suck her blood as a reward before returning to Alice. It was during this second interview that Ursula also recounted other neighbourly disputes. John Stratton had called her names, and his wife had refused Ursula's son's spices when he asked for them. So, in retaliation to this, Ursula again asked Alice to send the spirit Jack to Stratton's wife. It did as it was asked and was allowed to drink blood from Ursula's thigh and also from Alice Newman. This second confession was definitely aimed as transferring the blame from herself to Alice Newman. Alice was also examined the same day, and she gave her version of events. She admitted going to Ursula's house and that they had fallen out, admitted calling her a witch, but vehemently denied everything else that Ursula said transpired between them. Well, even if it was true, you wouldn't go around admitting to it, would you? But poor Alice made a big mistake when talking to Darcy. He threatened to remove her spirits if she didn't cooperate, but she informed him that this would not be possible as she would keep them with her. Oops. She then quickly added that that would only be the case if she had any spirits in the first place. But too late. Darcy's witch hunt had officially begun. But Darcy needed to find more evidence. And naturally, this was a task he took to with earnest. Darcy spoke to Alice's neighbour, William Hook, and he'd said that he'd heard her husband, William, blame her for his current misery. But he couldn't elaborate on what that was. So basically, he was just an eavesdropping arse to a couple having a disagreement. Or at least, that's my take on it. He also claimed to have overheard more than once at mealtimes, when specifically meat was being served, William saying, "Dost thou not see?" implying that something untoward was in the room. That's an assumption at its finest. Alice was said to tell him to give it some meat and it would go away. Again, we could have been talking about a stray cat that's wandered in, a mouse that's living in the wall, a rat. Doesn't necessarily point to something witchy, wooey, demonic, anything like that, but then look at the era we're in. Everything was witchcraft. In another confession, Ursula made a few. She incriminated several more women. This time, it was Elizabeth Bennet, Alice Hunt, and Agnes Glasscock. If any of you are Vampire Diaries fans like I was, Elizabeth Bennet. We have a Bennet witch. Woohoo! Sorry. Inner teenager coming back out. Now, Ursula claimed that Elizabeth Bennet kept a ferret spirit in a pot, and she knew this because 3 months earlier, what is it with 3 months? She had visited for some milk and saw the creature through the window. She was just peeking to see if Elizabeth was home. She said that Elizabeth also had 2 spirits called Suckin and Leard. This is something that her spirit, Tiffin, had told her son. And she claimed Elizabeth had caused the death of the wife of a man named Byatt and made 3 of his cows ill, 2 of which actually died. The 3rd was only saved by a fire being lit around the creature, who fled from the heat. Ursula further claimed Elizabeth sent a spirit to torment a child, and that she was also the cause of deaths of Mr. Willingale and the wife of William Willies, who suffered for many years before passing. Ursula told Darcy that Alice Hunt also had a ferret spirit that she kept in a pot, and that she'd also seen this by peering through a window. Nosy bitch. Tiffin, the little grass, had again told her of the spirit's doings. 6 livestock animals belonging to a Mr. Hayward had been killed by Hunt's behest. Hunt had rewarded the spirit with her blood. Ursula said that she was told by local shoemaker that Agnes Glasscock had bewitched his child and was also responsible for their death. She was also said to be responsible for the death of another child, and Tiffin again allegedly confirmed that this was true. Ursula then concluded with more words against Alice Newman, saying that she had been to see the man responsible for collecting and distributing money to the poor, Mr. Johnson. She asked for 12p for her sick husband, but was refused. So, naturally angry at this, Ursula alleged that Alice had sent her spirits to torment the man and his wife to death. Now, in becoming an informant, bless her, Ursula believed that Darcy would keep his promise and that she would ultimately be saved. Sweet, naive, well, maybe not sweet, but naive Ursula. She vowed to Darcy that Tiffin, to the best of her knowledge, has always told her the truth, and as such several of those she named were brought in for questioning. Agnes denied the allegations made against her, but this, unsurprisingly, did not prevent her from being searched. Spots were discovered on the left side of her thigh and also on her left shoulder, and these were the marks said to be where her familiars had fed on her. Darcy then arranged for Agnes and Ursula to be in the same room. Ursula made all the accusations given to Darcy to Agnes's face. This is when Agnes exploded with rage, screaming that she should scratch Ursula like the witch she was. She added that she was not guilty of the crimes, but was in fact a victim of bewitching from Ursula instead. Alice Hunt also denied the allegations, and stated that she had never fallen out with Hayward, nor kept a spirit in a pot, or plagued any cattle. A pot was brought out, and she was asked whether she fed her spirits from it. She said no, funnily enough. Nevertheless, a warrant was issued for her arrest, and Hunt, following Ursula's lead, asked to speak to Darcy alone. There, she was said to burst into tears and confess everything to him. Her spirits were named Jack and Robin, and were in the form of small colts, one black and one white. Her spirits had told her that Ursula would betray her, and she had. Hunt admitted that she was not the only member of her family dabbling in witchcraft. Her sister Marjorie Salmon also had 2 spirits of her own, and claimed that they had actually received their spirits from their mother, also a witch, who conveniently had died just 2 weeks prior. Marjorie was questioned and initially remained tight-lipped, but did finally admit to having 2 spirits of her own at her sister's behest. Fear was mounting rapidly in the small community of St. Osyth. Many of the accused followed Ursula's example and implicated others. Of course they did. Darcy probably gave them the same promise. Give them up, save yourself. Now, Marjorie named widow Jonah Peachy, or Petchy, who was also mentioned by Alice Hunt, and said that they had heard Joan talking when there was no one else in the house with her. If that's a sign of witchcraft, then I'm stuffed because I talk to myself all the time. And she also said that their mothers had told them Joan was a powerful witch and she had the power to know everything in every house in St. Osyth. That's just small place syndrome, isn't it? Now, if Darcy was hoping for another confession, he was surely really disappointed in this one, because Joan denied being a witch. She denied having any spirits or giving them to anyone. Now, she did say that she'd heard a man named Lurkin had heard Johnson say that Alice Newman had bewitched them, supporting Ursula's confession. Yep, small place syndrome, he said, she said. Over the following weeks, Darcy gathered as much information as he could from the residents of St. Osyth, and this naturally brought more names and more supposed evidence against the already accused. Darcy even managed to convince Alice Hall's daughter and Ursula's son Thomas to speak against their mothers and confirm what all the others had said, and even added details of their own. Thomas was just 8 years old at the time. And given Darcy's ability to manipulate, look at what he did with the promises to the women, I'm sure this poor little boy just thought that he was helping his mum. Bless him. Now, a couple, so yes, we've actually got a man accused of witchcraft here. Henry and Cicely Sellis were both accused after a fire destroyed their barn, and this was a supposedly magically starting fire. Cicely was also accused of of causing the death of Thomas Death's son. What a surname! And supposedly tormenting his daughter also, and also for making Mr. Death's pigs behave in strange ways. I couldn't find what sort of strange ways they were, but strange apparently. The accusations even began to come from further afield, so words spread out of St. Osyth now, with Alice Mansfield from nearby Thorpe being accused of causing a local constable's cart to get stuck in the ground after a disagreement. Now, with the ever-growing number of accused, was anybody actually safe? In early March, Ursula was moved to the jail at Colchester Castle, and several others would soon follow. I kind of imagine at this point, trying to put myself in Ursula's shoes, that she's probably starting to question her protected status and whether Darcy had actually meant his promise or not. But that didn't stop her flapping her gums, did it? No. She would continue to talk and incriminate more and more people to anyone who would listen. Maybe a little bit of desperation sinking in there, methinks. And one of the more out there accusations was on March the 9th, where Ursula claimed that Alice Newman had sent a spirit to kill the late Lord Darcy, a relation of Brian Darcy. Many would visit the witches in prison. I suppose a bit of a show. I'd have gone, would you? Now, one of these visitors was Henry Durrant, a local butcher, and he wanted to quiz one of them on the death of his daughter, because he believed there was a sinister cause. So Ursula told him that Alice Hunt and her mother, Mother Barnes, had bewitched the girl to cause her death, all because he had refused the two women pork when they asked for it. So as far as he was concerned, suspicions confirmed. Ursula's own brother, Lawrence Kempe, was one of the last to give evidence on the 20th of March. His wife had hurt her back and her private area, and had been ill for around 9 months before passing from the strange illness. She had told him on many occasions that Ursula had forsaken her, and that actually Ursula was the cause of the illness. So illness aside, the animosity between the two women had actually been brewing for a while, and they'd even had a physical altercation just a few years before Mrs. Kempe's death. Now, interestingly or conveniently, Ursula was actually present at the woman's bed when she died. Obviously something that was then going to be used against her, because she'd arrived uninvited, and when she took Mrs. Kempe by the arm, the ailing woman was said to gasp and die in that moment. Coinky dink, or... yeah, that don't look good, does it? So the trial of the women mentioned, and several others, took place on the 29th of March, 1582. And they were accused of a variety of crimes. Ursula and Alice Newman were indicted for murder on the 12th of February 1582, for bewitching Agnes Leatherdale's daughter and causing her death on the 26th of February, and also Edna Stratton, wife of John, bewitched on the 30th of November 1581, who died the 14th of February 1582, also the Thurlow baby on the 3rd of October 1581, and causing her death 3 days later. Oh, the poor bub survived for 3 days. Oh. Alice was remanded in custody, but despite Darcy's promise of leniency, Ursula was convicted and then sentenced to hang. I mean, come on, did anybody really believe him? I suppose clutching at straws and hoping, but did anybody really believe him? Elizabeth Bennet was also found guilty and set to hang with Ursula. Alice Hunt, interestingly, was found not guilty, but Agnes Glasscock was. Cicely Sellis, whilst acquitted on the arson charge, was unfortunately found guilty of bewitching the Death's son until he died, She remained on remand in prison, but unfortunately died before she could be released due to the horrific jail conditions, which were also rife with illness. I'm sure you guys can imagine for yourselves how horrific jail conditions were back in the 1500s. Wasn't going to be pretty, wasn't going to be clean. So, where are we? Right. Widow Joan Peachy, or Petchy, wasn't tried. She was actually discharged by proclamation because there was no evidence and no witnesses came forward to speak against her. But unfortunately, the elderly woman actually died in jail before she could be released. Now, we speculate that Alice Newman died in prison, although this can't be confirmed. Ursula Kempe and Elizabeth Bennet went to the gallows in 1582 in Chelmsford. Now, we're going to jump forward to 1921, and 2 skeletons were uncovered in a garden in St Osyth by Charles Brooker. Brooker had local knowledge, and he actually charged the locals cash to see the witch's skeleton. But this came to an abrupt end when the cottages in whose garden they had been found burnt down. Obviously the witches were to blame, but Brooker's grandson Paul would later say that he thought his grandfather had knocked over an oil lamp whilst drunk. Easily done. The skeletons stayed buried for 30 years until Paul's father wanted to build on the site. Then the skeleton thought to be Ursula was exorcised and sold to the Museum of Witches in Boscastle, which I'm pretty sure is in Cornwall, but don't quote me on that. Her skeleton was later sold to Robert Lenkiewicz, who was an eccentric Plymouth artist, collector, and a father of at least 13. So, busy man. He had a deep interest in the occult and was said to have more than 25,000 books on witches, the occult, demonology, and medieval philosophy. That would be one hell of a library, not gonna lie. Anyway, the most gruesome item in his possession wasn't actually Ursula's skeleton, but the body of a mummified tramp that was stored in a secret drawer discovered after his death. Lovely. Now, it was actually through the efforts of documentary maker John Morley, after Lenkiewicz's death, that the skeleton was returned to St Osyth. Although it was examined en route by one of Britain's top osteoarchaeologists, who discovered that the skeleton was actually that of a hard-working 25-year-old man and not a woman who was thought to have died in her mid-50s. Or could that have just been more witchcraft at play? What do you think? The skeleton, whether Ursula or not, was laid to rest in an unmarked grave in a corner of St Osyth Cemetery. So, whoever those bones belong to, may they rest in peace. But doesn't it make you glad that we're past the days where you could just point at someone and say, witch, because you didn't like them, you'd fallen out, you wanted something they got and you wanted them out the way, or whatever. It's just... ugh. I mean, the world's toxic now, but that just shows how easy toxic words can snowball. Watch your words, people. And if you misspeak, hold your hands up. I'm sorry. Didn't mean it like that. Came out wrong. Whatever. Own it. But yeah. So if you made it to the end, I would just like to say thank you for still being here listening to me ramble on. You can find me on the social networks at Seriously Now Pod. If you... oh, banging the microphone, sorry. If you want to suggest any content ideas or give us any feedback, the email address is seriouslynowpod@gmail.com. So next week, we're going to be talking about some aliens with the Pascagoula abduction. So, lovelies, until then, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.